galactic travelers, thanks for tuning in. Welcome to episode 2 of Resonant Being. I'm your host, Galen Farrel, and in this episode, we're going to talk about narrative. What is narrative? How does narrative perpetuate our own patterns in life? And how does cultural narrative underlie the current of our larger circumstance? So what is narrative? We think of narrative often in terms of stories, in terms of dialogue. It's a common way to address it. The narrative carrying the plot along, carrying the dialogue between the characters. Well, in the same way, we have a narrative within ourselves that carries our thoughts along and ultimately dictates our lives. In the previous video, we talked about resonance and explored the ways our thoughts perpetuate our demeanor, and that our thought patterns, our wavelengths, are in our power to control. So, it could be said that the narrative is the timeline of the accumulation of thought patterns into which we dictate our lives. So, what is a thought pattern? What is a narrative? Well, these things could be many things, but an example to talk about thought pattern would be generally if your thoughts are positive or negative. A better way to talk about it in terms of narrative, though, would be to look at your thoughts and try to notice whether you're being led or leading. Now, it's very easy to try to plan out our lives. It's trying to stick to those plans, however, that can cause ourselves great grief. Trying to be in control of things that are ultimately out of our control and never to be controlled. So our narrative is the story we're telling ourselves. It's our inner dialogue over which we have the power to influence and create our story. Now, planning has its place, and we need to be able to meet responsibilities and commitments with others and deadlines and take care of business when it needs to be done. But there is the tendency for us to try to place expectations on the day-to-day goings-ons of our lives, trying to write the narrative before it's happened, trying to cast into the future how things are going to be. And this is what I'm referring to is ultimately out of our control. So, by choosing to go with the flow, enter the Tao, be the watercourse way, that is to say, not try to dictate the future, not try to plan every detail of our lives, not hold expectations on how life is going to unfold and arise. We can change our narrative in a way that is light, that is enjoyable, that removes unnecessary responsibility. And that's a good thing, because life has enough responsibility already. So, our narrative could be said to be our personal dialogue. Now, with that definition in mind, let's talk about cultural narrative and how it carries the undercurrent of our larger circumstance. We now know our personal narrative. What is cultural narrative? Well, if we think in terms of what is narrative, and we think in terms of culture, we can talk about the stories that are told within our culture, almost behind the scenes. So much so that we hardly even think of it as a story. It most literally is our own living mythos. The story that we're telling ourselves is our cultural narrative. And so what are the aspects of this narrative? Well, the narrative is, like any mythos, how things came to be, how things must be, and how we shall continue. It's the story that gives us instruction upon what's acceptable and what's not. We base our actions upon our morality from this narrative. So, the kind of details that come up in our cultural narrative would include what's an acceptable way to live, a way to support ourselves, what are our livelihoods, how do we raise our children, what is acceptable marital statuses, or better said, relationships between men and women, because marriage is a cultural custom in itself. What foods we eat, how we spend our time. And if you think about it, across the world, there is a dominant culture, whether you be in Japan or Brazil, Germany, or gosh, I don't know, Montreal, anywhere really, that aside from customs are going to identify as being a specific kind of way. It's what I am, it's what you are, It's the people who drive cars and watch TV, or I guess now computers, who feed themselves through the exchange of money. That's our culture, that's our cultural narrative. Our cultural narrative informs us that we support ourselves by money, with money. We have to work to raise money to support ourselves. We operate in specific family units that are acceptable. We have specific relationships between men and women. I guess now men and men, women and women, things are changing. That's our cultural narrative. So, in the next video, I'm going to talk about culture. What is culture? And how culture grows and evolves. And from that, creates narrative. Thanks for tuning in. This is Resonant Being, and I'll see you next time.